Good morning, everybody, and welcome to another weekly presentation in the COVID-19 and Corruption series from the Center for International Private Enterprise. Today's event focuses on Latin America. As usual, if you have questions for the participants, for the speakers, please put them in the chat section, type them into the chat section, and they'll be read out later. And just so everybody knows, this 90-minute session will be recorded. With that, I'd like to introduce Andrew Wilson.
Thank you, Frank. And on behalf of the Center for International Private Enterprise, I would like to welcome you to Corruption and Government Responses to COVID-19 in Latin America. This is a virtual event featuring speakers from Mexico, Argentina, and Guatemala. This conference is the sixth in a series of public events on COVID-19 and corruption, which is being organized by our Anti-Corruption and Governance Center, which Frank Brown heads up. Today's event is a bit of a special one in the series, as it draws upon the resources of both my organization, CIPE, and our sister organization, the International Republican Institute, or IRI. Given our common commitment to democracy, it's no surprise that CIPE and IRI often collaborate. We've pooled our resources and compared notes in places from Ukraine to Thailand. And our collaboration has been especially close when it comes to anti-corruption, where we team up with our counterparts all over the world, but primarily from IRI Center for Global Impact here in Washington. Whether it's training Gambian parliamentarians on anti-corruption laws or coming up with new ways to hold officials accountable in the Maldives, CIPE and IRI have had a fruitful relationship over the years. And with that in mind, it's my great pleasure today to pass the mic to Scott Mastick, IRI's Vice President of Programs, who will introduce our first speaker. Scott, over to you.
Thank you, Andrew. It's a pleasure to partner with the Center for International Private Enterprise on this event today. I hope everyone out there is staying healthy and well, and also in good spirits. That's as important as washing your hands these days. The coronavirus pandemic is clearly a global health crisis. I don't think there's any debate about that. But it's also, from our standpoint, and I know CIPE's as well, a political and governance crisis that is stressing systems globally. We are seeing how all over the world, COVID is straining the ability of governments at all administrative levels to mount a holistic and effective response, while also fulfilling their normal institutional and democratic duties. This is particularly relevant when it comes to ensuring that public funds are well and adequately spent, and that governments respond to the public health crisis with spending levels that are now at unprecedented levels of spending, and where they may be needing to respond in emergency and sort of short-term manners that causes processes that normally are at play to be short-circuited. It's unsurprising that in the Latin America region, this has heightened concerns about corruption. And we've seen just in the last few weeks, ongoing protests in Chile, and also in Guatemala and in Honduras, much of which relates to citizen lack of competence in institutions driven by concerns about corruption and mistrust in what those institutions are doing to respond to the COVID crisis. So cognizant of these dynamics, IRI has been supporting relevant stakeholders in the region to be better equipped to combat corruption. Specifically, IRI in Latin America has worked to fight corruption on two primary fronts: equipping journalists with investigative tools to better document and expose corruption, and assisting multi-stakeholder coalitions to push for anti-corruption reform. We are lucky to have three speakers here today who are experts on these issues. And it is my pleasure to first introduce Damian Gonzalez. Damian is the projects coordinator for the public management program at CIPE, an Argentine think tank that works to build better public policies. Damian is also a professor of political science. Previously, he worked at International IDEA, a leading nonprofit focused on economic issues in the political and advocacy arena. He has also worked with several municipalities in the Buenos Aires province to coordinate and implement public policies. Demian, it's my pleasure to turn it over to you.
Thank you very much for the invitation and the introduction. So I'm proposing to tell you about some of the current affairs in Argentina regarding the coronavirus measures and fiscal policy, and some of the concerns that we have about anti-corruption. So let me start by telling you about Argentina's status regarding the coronavirus. We have 8,800 infected right now and 390 diseases people. So that's the lowest among biggest economies such as Peru, Brazil, Chile, and Mexico. These extraordinary numbers were achieved by some of the toughest restriction policies in Latin America. What do I mean by this? Mainly, in the first 2 weeks in Argentina, we faced high fines and maybe some criminal charges if we go out of the street. And we haven't seen that in some places like Chile, Brazil, and some of the places I mentioned. So this was, can I have my presentation, please? Maybe the first slide. Thank you. These numbers were achieved by several measures undertaken by the government in Argentina. The first slide, which we will see in a minute, will show you that these measures added to a previous crisis that Argentina had regarding the economy. So we have currently two big crises right now. I'm waiting for the PPT, but I can continue anyway. So this previous crisis regarding the economy gave Argentina a strong fiscal restriction. Argentina produced a fiscal response of approximately 4% of its GDP, which is between the normal parameters for developing countries, which they spend, according to Harvard's policy tracker, the developing countries spend 3 to 3.5% of their GDP, but Argentina's response is lowest than developed countries who spend 5% of their GDP in fiscal response to the COVID. So even though Argentina is having, there you go, is having a strong response, that's between the normal parameters. So in this first slide, you can see some of the laws and decrees that Argentina produced to tackle this crisis. Firstly, the December law tackling the economic crisis gave the government ample discretion to manage public spending. So the context, which I'm stating right there, was that during 2019, Argentina had 53% of inflation, which is a high number for our economy. And public debt rose up to 90% of the GDP. So that's hard to pay. And you will see some of the news right now saying that this week we are already negotiating those terms of that debt. The second decree that I'm citing in this slide goes straight to the pandemic era, to say it for some sort. Now, this is the second crisis that we face in less than 4 months, and Argentina is struggling with those, with managing those resources. This decree establishes the public health emergency, which gives the health ministry a lot of resources to manage this crisis, following the World Health Organization pandemic declaration on March 11th. The following decree that I'm citing in this slide is a recent decree which gave a lot of discussion in the legislative Congress. This decree, the 457, sanctioned in May the 10th, establishes a wide discretionary capability to the Chief of Staff to organize the national budget. So previous to this decree, the Chief of Staff could manage up to 5% of the national budget. And right now, even though we do not have a sanctioned budget by the Congress, as we should have, we are extending the 2019 budget, and the Chief of Staff has ample discretion to manage those resources, mainly to use them to the pandemic. This raises some concerns, mainly in Congress, but in all gives a legal framework to managing these resources. They're not as discretionary as it could be, but we would like to see a toughest or a more rigorous control over them. So going to the second slide, please. Thank you. We can see some of the budget consequences and public spending of this coronavirus crisis. So the executive branch executes 98% of the national budget as of May of 2020. This means that we have to put a special focus in controlling those expenses, right? So we at CIPE, we got the chance to see the before and after up to April of 2019 versus April 2020. And we can see, even though there's some overlapping in those numbers and sentences, that in 2019, social spending went up to 57%, while as in 2020, after the crisis, remember we are seeing these numbers 1 month into the crisis, in April 2020, social spending, which includes health spending and social assistance spending, went to 76%, like going up 10% from last year. And the debt services, which pay the foreign debt that Argentina has, both foreign and domestic, went down by 15%. So this means that Argentina is within the boundaries of fiscal restriction, but prioritizing social assistance amidst the pandemics. This adds to the argument that Argentina is tackling two crises at the time with the same resources. And Argentina currently is printing a lot of money as a policy, and then that's a concern to pull back that money over the next few months, so we don't have as much of a high rate inflation. So next slide, please. This is some of the previous slides showed you what the executive power has done legally within its powers, and the fiscal response to COVID-19 in Argentina. Those were, as I told you, strong responses in both levels, but Argentina doesn't have as much as resources as developed countries. Like the United States is spending more than 12% of its GDP. Germany is spending 77% of its GDP. And so Argentina has to move within the boundaries of its fiscal restriction. That, anyway, it's a lot of money. So Argentina has a strong responsibility in the public sector, but as well as in the NGO sector, to control those budget executions. So in this slide, I would like to tell you some of the transparency policies that Argentina it's had right now, but holds sustainably in the last few years. Since 2012, Argentina is implementing the action plans for the OGP. For those of you who do not know the OGP, it's the international organization that gives guidelines to open government. And Argentina is a member since 2012, and right now it's in its 4th action plan. We at CIPE participated in some of those tables, and the previous government gave a lot of importance to these policies, and the current government maintained those policies. So we do not expect any changes in that. Secondly, in 2016, the law the law of access to public information and transparency was sanctioned. It gave extensive guidelines for all of state, I mean the three branches of power and some decentralized organizations to establish transparency policies, which are currently sustained. Thirdly, since 2016, Argentina has online the Comprar portal, which gives lots of information regarding the conditions, the bids, public contracting, and purchases for goods and services. This was very important for Argentina to have, to know what Argentina is spending its public budget on. So these policies are sound and strong and are currently sustained by the government, but they are supported by a lot of institutions that control the expenses. So we have three main institutions that control this public spending. They are important. One of them is CIPE, a control office in the executive power that it's in ministries, SOEs, state-owned enterprises, and decentralized organizations. Secondly, we have the Audit Office of the Nation that depends on the legislative power. This is oftenly controlled by the opposition, so we have a sound control there, but that control is after the public spending took place. So we can see some of the reports as much as six months or a year later of the deed. And then we have the Anti-Corruption Office. We, during the last years, took different approaches to the anti-corruption issue, but it's currently active. And I will tell you in a few minutes about that. Next slide, please. So to see some of the challenges that Argentina faces right now amidst the pandemic, we have, as I told you, a strong legal framework for transparency and integrity. We have strong laws sanctioned by the Congress, which are not going back to what we were. And we have strong institutions, both held by the executive power, which has resources to hold those institutions, and by the opposition, who have a more critic and key approach to this control role. So public spending is overseen by strong legal framework and institutions, but we have seen some need for strengthening implementation. What do I mean by this? We recently saw two cases of overprices at the national level and the local level, which have different political parties at power. The president is from the Peronist Party, and the chief of government of the Buenos Aires city is from the opposition coalition. So firstly, in the National Social Development Ministry, we saw some food purchases that had overprices. And right there, we saw prices going from as much as twice of the top prices that the government established. But some of the questions that one can have looking at these cases is that we could see in real time these public purchases in food. I mean, they bought food to help to add to the social assistance policies that we saw earlier. And we could see in real time that food purchase and the overprices that they had. This purchase was immediately withdrawn by the government, and 16 public officers had to resign because of this. Among them was one state secretary. We have a minister, a secretary, undersecretary, and so on. This wasn't the only case, as I told you. The second case was the face mask purchases by the government of the city of Buenos Aires, which acquired 1,600 face masks for combating coronavirus, and paid as much as 3 times the market value for those face masks, which represented approximately 3,000 pesos. We had to make the conversion to dollars. That's really tough. But an undersecretary had to resign because of that. And that's the same case as the nation. We could see in real time that overprice and that public purchase, because there's strong legal framework and institutions to control these purchases, but there's a low capability to implement policies itself. We can control them, but we have to have a sound implementation capability. So next slide, please. So to have a more optimist view of this, the Anti-Corruption Office recently gave some guidelines 5 days ago to manage public purchases. And they gave some, I will highlight 3 of that recommendations that I think are pretty illustrative of what we are experiencing right now. The first one of them is to limit emergency procedures. So the Anti-Corruption Office is recommending for public officers not to go by emergency procedures, but to attain itself by normal procedures as public bidding and all of that. The second recommendation that we saw from the Anti-Corruption Office 5 days ago was to mind of the conflict of interest, not contract familiars, friends, or any of that could go under the conflict of interest. So the third recommendation that we saw is to sign an integrity pact. That's a continuation of the policy long had by the Anti-Corruption Office the last 3 to 4 years. So that's important for the 2 parties, the government and the enterprises that provide a service, to have an integrity pact. So my argument about the need to strengthen the implementation of policies and mainly public purchases has some data behind it. So I'm proposing to present that with this slide, and then I can go over, turn over to Ana Lilia if I'm not overtimed. So according to CIPE's available research, 93% of directors in the public administration, that's below the level of undersecretary, but they have management responsibility. 93% of them are appointed temporarily. That means that they have a political appointment and they do not go through public tendering. Less than 1% of them go through public tendering for those public offices. So, and 80% of them are accepted of requirements, professional and educational requirements. So that means that we have public managers without the standards that we would like to implement these policies. Secondly, leaning on the research that we have on SOEs, one of the projects that we have with CIPE, we have a high specialization and executive experience of board members of SOEs, but we have low specific experience as a board member to control the company and oversee their spending. So we would, these 2 simple data that we show right here gives away some of the intuitions and concerns that we have strong institutions, but we need to strengthen professionalization and implementation of policies. Thank you.
Damian, thank you very much. I'd like to remind everybody that they are in a 90-minute session put on by the Center for International Private Enterprise and the International Republican Institute, focused on COVID-19 and corruption challenges. This week, we're looking at government responses to COVID-19 from Latin America. If you have questions, we'll be taking them in the chat box. So just type your question in the chat box. You'll see the function down there at the edge of your screen, and we'll pose it to the participants. If you have a person you'd like to aim the question at specifically, just put that person's name there. With that, I'd like to introduce Ana Lilia Moreno with Mexico Evalúa. It's a think tank engaged in researching public policies. Previously, Ana served as an economic advisor at the board of the Federal Institute of Telecommunications. She's also been a manager at the Center of Research for Development, and before that worked for 14 years for large companies on questions regarding oil and gas, manufacturing, banking, infrastructure, and telecommunications. With that, I'll hand it over to you, Ana.
Hello, thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. I'm very happy to be here today. I apologize because my camera is not working with this platform, but here I am, and I would like to share with you some insights regarding our findings in our research at Mexico Evalúa, which are mostly focused on competition and regulation matters. So in this talk, I will focus on small and medium enterprises. As you can see in my first slide, according to the Inter-American Development Bank, it is estimated that the impact in the Latin American region could result in a contraction of about 4% of GDP in 2020. That is a significant contraction. Small and medium enterprises, or SMEs, are at the center of the economic crisis caused by the COVID-19 pandemic and containment measures rather than during the 2008 financial crisis. The current crisis has revealed a vulnerability of these kind of enterprises to the supply and demand shocks, particularly with regard to their liquidity. And there is a serious risk in the region that more than 50% of SMEs will not survive in the coming months. Moreover, in some countries, a deterioration in the financial situation of SMEs could have systemic effects on the banking sector as a whole, with serious consequences for the whole economy, with complications for a prompt recovery. According to the United Nations Agency for Latin America Economic Assessment, unemployment is forecasted to reach thoroughly 11.5%. So it is a very worrying situation. Nearly 38 million of Latin American people will probably be unemployed during the crisis and after the crisis. Next slide, please. Mexico is no exception. I will give you some numbers. SMEs represent 99.8% of all formal businesses. They employ 78.5% of employed personnel and contribute to half of the GDP. So 8 out of 10 SMEs are in danger of being paralyzed by the impact of the coronavirus pandemic. Experts and even official bodies have assessed that nearly 57% will have difficulty paying their employees and 25% will be forced to fire staff. So the forecastings estimate that 1 million jobs could be lost in the short term and 100,000 micro businesses could be closed. I would like to add here that Mexico has a very high rate of informality. So nearly 57% of companies are not included in the formal statistics. They do not pay taxes. They're informal people, self-employed, or very micro businesses. And they are also included in these statistics. And maybe they could be higher in terms of crisis and the need of assistance. Next slide, please. Let's go to the government responses. And I maybe will go very fast in this slide because our government, President López Obrador, who took office in 2019, he has rejected implementing a contra-cyclical policy. And he also has denied debt offers from the International Monetary Fund, from the World Bank. Nevertheless, the rates are very attractive because of the special offers. He has rejected them. And also he has announced the private sector that there will not be any tax exemptions or reductions, no rescues for big firms by the federal government. And why is he taking this strong position despite the crisis that comes? Because when he took off, he believed his current social policies are enough for mitigating the crisis and the shock on economic units. We have to admit that these programs, which is a portfolio of money transfers to different sectors of the population, include some programs of monetary transfers to SMEs, equivalent to $1,000 per unit. That is not enough, of course, for granting security or sustainability to an economic unit in the crisis. What he has done in the late 2 months is to put speed to the distribution of these money transfers. However, he also announced that during the crisis, big infrastructure projects as oil refineries valued in $88 billion, for example, one of them, and new trains for tourism in the Maya Peninsula will keep going on. Meanwhile, some of the states, our political administration is a federation. Some states have unilaterally issued their own regulatory measures, and some of them have destined monetary transfers and debt reliefs to small and medium enterprises. However, the budget that they have destined to these programs is very little. It's about $583 million in all the countries, so that's really not enough. However, our states are very are not very solvent, or they don't have liquidity. They depend a lot on the centralized transfers, tax transfers, so they cannot do a lot. Some autonomous bodies and private sector have contributed. The central bank, for example, has lowered the interest rates by 50 basis points to 6.5, and has announced various actions of greenbacks as liquidity offers to support the country's financial system, which has have a good response from the private sector. Banks have also granted different programs to the debtors. So there are some initiatives from the private sector that may help to relieve partial redundancies, wage subsidies, some changes in financial instruments, but all this comes from the private sector. Even some efforts for teleworking, digitalization, innovation, but they are very short in comparison to the needs of the country, that mostly depend on the federal government, who is not very willing to apply countercyclical measures. Next slide, please. So In terms of corruption and governance responses, we have a federal secretary of the public function, which is in charge of the anti-corruption programs in Mexico. And it is part of a very complex system that was constituted during the previous administration, which is a transversal system of anti-corruption efforts. It's a system. One of the main bodies that governs this system is the Secretary of the Public Function. In relation to the procurement of medicines and supplies within the health sector, these bodies have implemented preventive accompaniment in the process of public procurement. It is not very clear if they are doing it in the right way, because some of independent journalist associations have identified serious acts of corruption in the processes of ventilators acquisitions, for example. And the public function has been obliged to investigate these acquisitions. But what we see is that there is an intention of the federal government to pursue these acts of corruption. However, this legal framework for combating corruption at the federal and at the subnational level is still in consolidation process. So we cannot say that we have a very strong legal or institutional framework to pursue corruption acts. And regarding these money transfers to small and medium enterprises, we can see that Mexico is really getting very late. And what we need is establishing specific and extraordinary corruption programs for social programs and for monetary transfer to SMEs. At Mexico Evalúa, we have detected that the subnational governments are not distinguishing between social programs and economic programs. And that has an importance because Mexico could take advantage of the crisis for turning it out into an opportunity to promote sustainability of small and medium enterprises and combat informality. This could be a good timing for this, but governments are not very conscious about it. Announcing a comprehensive, solid anti-corruption strategy for economic support in multi-level coordination between the federal government and local authorities would be a must in these moments, but we are not seeing that. Seizing the crisis for converting it on an opportunity for promoting sustainability could be also an opportunity for combining better regulation programs and policy and anti-corruption policies at a federal and subnational level. At Mexico Evalúa, we have been researching a lot on better regulation policy as a mechanism for combating informality and for providing internal markets with more elements for a better competition and for efficient markets. And that can be linked to anti-corruption policy. Next slide, please. Thank you. And I want to slow down a bit and delve on on this last slide, because for explaining you that the national anti-corruption system has a subnational offices and organization. And it also has a design which is able to include social society in it. So at the same time, better regulation policy has also a multi-level structure, and we have also discussed this at the federal level, that this crisis could be an opportunity for linking both systems, the better regulation system and the anti-corruption system, at both the federal and the subnational levels, so that efforts for scrutinizing these small or big money transfers to companies can be done in a two-way or with a double purpose. That is for reaching sustainability of small and medium enterprises based on solid programs or sound programs that include indicators, tracking of results, and at the same time for involving civil society in the audit process. And I would like to go to bullet 3, which is the one that says implementation of various types of audits, including social audits at local level, for promoting citizen participation in coordination with government, private sector, and academia. Best practices can be taken from the United Nations manuals and handbooks, as well as from the best practices of some countries where social audits are already present. And this is important in terms of the timing, because Mexico is very late in implementing this type of audits. We already have an audit system that is official, the Superior Audit Office, which probably will select some of these transfers next year and will scrutinize them and will yield with results and recommendations, and probably with subsequent acts of prosecution of corruption acts. However, social audits can be a very good opportunity for Mexico, as they are accountability mechanisms where citizens at a very local level can organize and mobilize to evaluate or audit government performance and public policy decisions, and even they can be done at in real time. Not necessarily after the purchases have done or have been done. It is organized exclusively by civil society and institutions who have a duty to facilitate what is necessary for the audit to be carried out. And we consider that a participatory tool that can become a mechanism to control corruption and improving the performance of governments and authorities at all levels, from the federal one to the subnational levels, can be essential for maintaining an openness and collaboration and fortifying democracy on these matters. I would also like to mention that it is needed to implement best international standards for public acquisitions and anti-corruption measures in the course of the pandemic, not only in these programs focused to small and medium enterprises, but also to all the matters that surround the health system and the urgencies that are needed and that demand products, services, vaccines during this pandemic. And in Mexico, we are not very happy with the system that is currently going on regarding public acquisitions. And even though the pandemic justifies sometimes the direct acquisition and the diminishment of tenders, this system is very, very feeble in Mexico, and also sometimes it is taken as a reason for doing direct acquisitions, as a justification, and that is worrisome. Finally, developing an extraordinary plan for managing information from whistleblowing systems can be also a good effort for coordination with the multi-level audit auctions. So Finally, I would like to wrap up with some initiatives that the citizen participation has done in Mexico for providing at least an outline of the anti-corruption efforts that need to be implemented during the pandemic, and it's related to transparency and access to information. And during this pandemic, we have seen that access to information has become slower, and that is worrisome as well, because citizens need to know more information from the government, from statistics to certain matters regarding public acquisitions and solutions for the pandemic at a local level. So there is like a coalition of civil organizations who are demanding for more transparency, because we don't see a quick response from the government. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much as well. That was wonderful. Our last presenter for this presentation, which is 90 minutes on corruption and government responses to COVID-19, is Enrique Naveda, and he's the co-founder of Plaza Publica, Guatemala's first online investigative magazine, where he began as a managing editor and then became general coordinator and editor-in-chief. By way of background, Plaza Publica is regarded as one of the most trustworthy outlets in Guatemala and Latin America. Before I hand over the microphone to Enrique, I'd like to remind folks that if you have a question, please feel free to pose it in the chat function. So just type it in and we'll read it out during the Q&A. We're hoping to allow at least 30 minutes for Q&A at the end of Enrique's presentation. Thank you. Enrique?
Hi. Hello?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay, good morning. Plaza Publica, as it's been said, is an in-depth online outlet that has many different lines of investigation. Corruption is not our main focus, but a sideline, and our work probes on systemic corruption and state capture more than on accountability. However, I promise to do my best. And I think we may analyze the relation between corruption and the COVID emergency on different levels, because otherwise we may fall in a delusion trap. When we are going through an emergency like this, we tend to look at public procurement systems because state of corruption rules tend to relax procurement standards. A state of calamity, which is similar to a state of emergency in the US, I believe, was approved before we even had a patient zero more than 2 months ago. After that, we've had what we expected in Guatemala and in the region. A report by Red Palta, a Latin American network of journalists against corruption, found widespread lack of transparency, and in Guatemala, pervasive fear among low-level officials. They also found an erosion of procedural standards and low quality in procurement, overpricing, and also overbuying. But I would say to a lower point than we expected. We may add that people are raising claims that some bureaucrats are stealing even meals donated daily for doctors and health staff, burgers, sausages, and so on, just to let you know to what extent this might be ridiculous. Just a minute, mi amor. Ahora no puedo. Va, ponlo. Sorry, sorry about that. At Plaza Publica, we've investigated public procurement during the state of calamity for the last 2 months, and we found some of these problems. Our investigations have led to the destitution of a Deputy Minister of Health and the resignation of another one, and have sparked public prosecutors' investigations against a corruption network in the Ministry of Health. 8 people were found to be taking part in this network. But still, our findings, as I said, even though they amount to millions of dollars, are minor regarding what could have been expected. Why do I say so? Or why do I think this is happening? I think there is a paradox. One kind of corruption may be limiting another kind of corruption, may be limiting procurement corruption. Patronage and nepotism at the early stages of government. This is the government that started that took office in January. Patronage and nepotism at this early stage of government limit the corruption network's efficiency, since they are not able yet to control the machinery of the state in their own benefit. Given that people are not appointed because of their merit and of their knowledge, they are not even able to control the state's machinery. That happens at least at a national level, which is of course the biggest level. But municipalities are also already assigning fraudulent contracts for water supply and water infrastructure, medicines, food, and so on. Many mayors have been re-elected, and they have the structure to and the knowledge to run this kind of contracts. But the evidence we have about this is anecdotal, I would say. Not many people are investigating how mayors and municipalities and town halls are behaving during the crisis. On the other hand, our main concern for the future has to do with aid packages. Aid packages, depending on debt, have been spurred and approved by a heterogeneous alliance in the Congress with vested interests and a history of corruption. Most of the aid programs have not been launched yet, and the ones that have are still initiating, like the one involving cash transfers that started a couple of days ago. So we don't have much evidence about how corrupted they might be, or how it may work in the future. But we believe that expert and resilient corruption networks will activate them. These resilient and expert corruption networks are entrenched in the Congress, and are entrenched in the auditor's office, are entrenched in the governor's system around the country, and they have the knowledge and they have the experience to work corruption out. I would say that they planted the seeds of corruption in the decrees approving debt and aid measures 1.5 months ago, and these seeds will grow. And I am afraid a weakened civil society lacks the tools to oversee extensively those programs in the future, starting now, as I said. And given the opacity of the government, and I would say that this is probably the less transparent government I've seen in the last 16 years in Guatemala. I'm Spanish. I've been living in Guatemala for 16 years almost, and this is the most opaque government in my time here. I am afraid that civil society will lack the tools to oversee these programs, and the task will fall on the auditor's office and the Congress, which, as I said, belong to the corrupted networks in many ways, and none of them has the incentives to control spending, given they and their clientelism networks may benefit from them. And there is also another office that will take part in this control system, that is the brand new and very weak anti-corruption commissioner's office, which depends on the president. So most of its strength will depend on the president's political will to weaken corruption, and we are not certain that the president will have the will or the strength to undermine these networks and undercurrents of corruption. Thank you.
Thank you, Enrique, very much. And thank you to all our presenters. We've got some good questions in the chat section. I wanted to remind folks again that they are welcome to submit questions there. Just type them in and I'll read them out. And I also wanted to remind folks that we've got about 35 more minutes left in this 90-minute session. We'll be devoting it to Q&A. And if you are interested in this subject matter generally, please feel free to drop us a line, to send us an email at acgc@cipe.org, and we will sign you up for a WhatsApp channel, which is devoted to anti-corruption and COVID-19 issues. So our first question comes from Juanita Alaya, who ordinarily is based in Berlin and may now be back in Colombia, I'm not sure, but she is a long-term fellow traveler with CIPE on corruption issues, has worked for years in this sphere in a variety of functions. And her question for Ana, so Ana, get ready. This question for Ana from Juanita Alaya is concerning the multi-level governance point. This is quite an interesting one. Have you been able to identify or see any incentives or opportunities for local governments to better coordinate locally the better regulation and the anti-corruption structures? Or have you seen incentives in general for them to increase local integrity in the context of the pandemic? So Ana, that's for you. It's a question from Juanita Alaya.
Thank you, Juanita. Your question is quite interesting. I can tell you that I have seen, or we have seen, there are some incentives and there are no incentives. And I will provide you some arguments. A coordinated response from all levels of government can minimize failures in crisis management. And the main risk of uncoordinated action in this crisis to other levels of government, like passing the ball to them, will result in a disjointed response. So at Mexico Evalúa, we have talked to the Better Regulation Commission at the highest level of it, with the commissioner, for providing him with our point of view, and he accepted that there is a need to celebrate or to sign in an agreement with the anti-corruption system in order to establish a multi-level coordination effort, like an urgency as well in parallel to the urgency that is going on. There is an incentive there. There is also another incentive regarding the private sector and also the social sector, because as I mentioned during the presentation, the federal government is not very willing to provide any extraordinary programs or measures for mitigating the effects of the crisis. So the money transfers that are currently being done from the federal government as the regular programs, and from the local entities, the federal entities, as extraordinary programs, need to reach the beneficiaries of this money, of these resources. So the private sector is very worried about the death of 50% of the small and medium companies in the economy, and the consequences that this may have in the financial sector, and the high risk that there exists that this crisis that can be temporal of 1 year maybe, or 2, it can be extended to 10 or 15 years. So there is a concern, and there is a conscience in the social sector, universities, academia, think tanks, so NGOs dedicated to the relief of humanitarian relief. You also know that Mexico has a lot of immigration flows from Central America. So all these circumstances configure a real incentive for tackling corruption in the programs of the COVID-19 response. I think that there is an incentive. However, legal framework for doing, for example, social audits is not very strong in Mexico. There are some states of the country that do have citizen participation law or act, but they need refining for permitting, for example, independent social controllers that may lead the social audit efforts, that may entangle alliances with or international organizations, the United Nations, for training, for implementing real social audits. We need a more solid legal framework on that. And some states, they lack of a citizen participation law that may provide certainty to the implementation of these programs. So there are no incentives there for doing this. We need to build them up. So that I hope I gave you some answers on this.
Anna, thank you very much. That was superb. We've got another question now coming in from for Damien. A reminder to those on this call: if you have a question, just type it into the chat function and we'll put it to one of the panelists. So this question for Damian in Argentina with CIPE, the person asks to him, what do you see as the greatest corruption risk coming out of your government's response to COVID-19?
Well, thank you for the question. I see maybe two of the greatest concerns for Argentina policy response. Has to be one of them, the budgetary allocations of money made to the response of the coronavirus. Currently, Argentina is implementing several policies, mainly in the economic arena. As I told you, Argentina is tackling two crises right now: the sanitary one about the COVID, and the economic one, when the economy plummeted in December of 2019. So right now we are tackling those two crises with specific programs. Argentina destined 10,000 pesos for approximately 8 million people in Argentina. 10,000 pesos is approximately $100. You cannot make that much with that, but gets you by for a month at least. And this is destined for people with low resources, and the government is planning on expanding that program. So Argentina often has a problem that temporary measures are sustained over time. So we would like to see that as a contained policy and not extend over time, because this money is coming from ANSES, which is the Social Security Agency, which manages money for social programs and retirement funds. So that's money is coming from somewhere. The ANSES has lots of investments and resources, but they have to be properly managed, so we can have a retirement policy that's sustainable over time. We cannot give away that for temporary social policy. So that's a concern And the second big policy that Argentina is implementing, it's a complementary salary, to say it at some point. The Argentinian government is giving as much as half of the salary for the private sector. That's destined for small and medium enterprises and as well to big companies. So that's a necessary measure in this moment, but we would like to see that control or audit or at some point. So the main concern for that money transfer, which is the big policy Argentina is having right now for the two crises that I mentioned, we would like to see a more simultaneous control of those funds. Maybe some participation of the opposition in some of the committees, because the control organisms that I mentioned earlier, two of them, the Anti-Corruption Office and the General Audit of the Nation, act after the fact. I'm not saying corruption, I'm saying the public spending. So we can see that after it happened. But maybe some control is due to the decision making for that public spending, mainly because we have several laws which I mentioned, which were sanctioned between March and April, that give a lot of discretion for the executive power to use that money. So that's the main concern for us. Thank you.
Damian, thank you very much for a quite thorough answer. So next question, and we've got questions coming in pretty quickly now on the chat function. This is a question from Edgar Lazundia, and he's our counterpart over at the International Republican Institute, with whom we are co-sponsoring this event. And over the years, we've had a very fruitful collaboration with Edgar and his colleagues at IRI. So Edgar asks, this is a question for Enrique. He asks him, could you elaborate on the delusion trap when analyzing COVID-19 and corruption that you mentioned at the beginning of your intervention? So again, Enrique, a question for you. Could you elaborate on the delusion trap when analyzing COVID-19 and corruption that you had mentioned at the beginning of your intervention?
Yes, I wonder why I say these kind of things, because it's not a formal concept or anything. It's just something I made up to explain a basic idea I had in my mind before the panel. I mean, I think we are having a momentary delusion. We are seeing a mirage right now, namely that we feel that there is not as much corruption going on during these first 2 months of the emergency as we might have seen or as we might have expected. And this mirage, namely that no corruption is going on, might lead us to relax ourselves and not pay as much attention as why this is not happening. And I feel that this is not happening because of two different explanations. The first one, which are more systemic and more structural than the process of procurement itself. The first one is that another kind of corruption, less visible and less immediate to the people than how money is spent, is pervading everything. And that one is how people appoint officials or staffers or public service people. So the people who work for the state. These people are not appointed on merit or on their expertise on how they can solve problems, but they are appointed because they belong to networks of patronage, clientelism, or whatever. So they are not even able to process the corruption efficiently, because they don't even know how to do it, how to mold the state in their own benefit. When they do, it will take them a couple of months, 3 months, 4 months. That's what it usually takes them. But the COVID emergency has happened it started in the second month of government, so they wouldn't even master the mechanisms to be corrupt themselves. It is salient that we found corrupt or probably fraudulent contracts in the in the Ministry of Health, only where there was an expert, namely the former vice minister, the former deputy minister of administration. He was not a new official. He used to be a high-ranking official in the last government as well. So he had a network. He knew how to process corruption. It is very salient that we only found corruption there where there was an expert network. So this is part of the problem. And the other part of the problem that is not being very noticed, that is going unnoticed, is that probably corruption is being planted for the next 2 months with laws and decrees passed by the Congress, by mainly a corrupt alliance that links the government party with some other minor parties that in the past years were associated with the kicking out of CIPE, the UN panel against corruption that was investigating in Guatemala for more than 1 decade and sent at least 2 presidents to jail. So the delusion trap, as I called it, is no more than that. That we might be feeling kind of relaxed right now because we are not seeing as much corruption in public procurement systems as we might have expected, but there are structural there are structures that have to let us think that it will happen in the future if we don't create the mechanisms to control them. And that is something that concerns me a lot because in the last years, the civil society has been the one that has controlled or overseen these processes. But civil society in the last 2 years has been weakening very rapidly. So yeah, I'm quite worried about that.
Enrique, thank you very much. Our next question is somewhat technical in nature. So we've only got about 15 minutes. And if you, the 3 panelists, if nobody is prepared to answer it, that's fine. We could just take a pass on it. But the question from Robert Bacon reads, financial institutions and many businesses must comply with anti-money laundering regulatory requirements. In the face of the threat of COVID-19, are any countries in Latin America activating and providing updated guidance to report to National Financial Intelligence Units, FIUs, of any suspicious financial activity that red flags emerging from COVID-19 related corrupt and fraudulent practices? Following funding streams can reveal very much. Financial intelligence is vital for transparency and oversight. So of the panelists, anybody feel like taking that question?
I can briefly weigh in on that question.
Thank you. Thank you.
We do not have specific research on that, but I would like to raise the concern that that will be very helpful to control at the same time that the spending is being made. And I think that artificial intelligence and big data can be very helpful on that. And we lack a development on that issue. So the concern is great, and it's really a keen look to the matter, but we do not have a specific research on that. Thank you.
Okay. So, Damian, thank you very much for taking that question. Again, about 15 minutes left. Want to make sure we get to all the questions. So here's another one for you, Enrique, from Alejandro. If you could answer it fairly quickly so we can make sure we have time for everything. So the question to you, Enrique, is the newly created presidential commission, I'm assuming in Guatemala, to fight corruption presented a case last month against alleged irregularities in purchases of medication from the Ministry of Health. Is this a good sign? Do you think this commission will have an important role fighting corruption during this emergency?
Well, I think it is indeed a good sign, but we have to say that this anti-corruption commission did that after we presented evidence that this was going on. So we might say that they were following our steps. We don't know if it would have happened if now journalistic outlet had denounced this process or this contract. But still, it is a good sign because former governments have never paid attention to what the press said in order to initiate investigations, internal investigations or prosecutions. This commissioner's office does not supersede the public prosecutor's office. It just initiates some sort of investigation, which might not be called investigation because the only one allowed to investigate legally is the public prosecutor's office, and builds a report that passes to the public prosecutor's office. So the commission, this presidential commission, is quite weak in its functions and also in its budget. And it's closely linked to the president's will. So we might think that this first case, the only case in which they've acted, is a case that affected someone that was not close to the president or even strong figures in the cabinet. We don't know what will happen when corruption claims affect people who are very close to the president or to his people. We still have to be confident because we didn't even expect this kind of reaction from the commission. So it's a good sign, but we are not that what's the word? Well, I don't find the word. It's a good sign, but we are not as confident as we were, for instance, with CIPE. It's not an independent institution, and it's very, very weak for the moment.
Thank you, Enrique. And it's good to get a fresh readout on the situation, the post-CIPE situation from Guatemala. Our next question comes from Carmen, and this is a question to anybody who wants to take it among the panelists. So the question is, why would the IMF and the World Bank facilitate millions of dollars to well-known corrupt states? Are they part of the problem? Couldn't they set some kind of measure or condition, short-term and long-term, to force governments to take strong measures against corruption? Again, asking why would the IMF and World Bank be facilitating millions of dollars going to corrupt states? And
I can briefly weigh in on that and then let the floor to Ana and Enrique. From CIPE, we have made some research about that. I think that firstly, we do not have corrupt states. We do have some corrupt public officers, and we have to strengthen the control mechanisms that we have so that happens less and less. The risk is impossible to eliminate, but we have to minimize it. So going specifically to the question, I think the IMF and the World Bank have to lend money to our countries because we are in a crisis, and as I said before, Argentina is tackling 2 crises at a time. But the great advantage of the money coming from those international multilateral institutions is that they have with strong institutional bound. What do I mean by this? That the loans that they give have specific clauses and provisions so that we have to comply with that. And adding to that concern, Argentina is in the long path of becoming an OECD member, and that comes with lots of laws and institutions that have to be currently active so the country is able to tackle corruption. So I think that we are on the way of becoming a better country regarding anti-corruption, and international organizations wouldn't have to withdraw their support and their money, and they're lending money from developing countries. That would be against the purpose. Thank you.
Thank you, Damian. Enrique, Ana, anything to add?
I would like to add that this pandemic was very sudden. It really came really fast, and the world is reacting to survival, to the survival state. And I think that these international organizations are responding as well with the experience, or based on the experience of the 2008 and 9 crisis. They know that a collapse of the financial system would crash out the world, and the effects of this pandemic would be more difficult to recover. So I think that this pandemic will give us lessons, and one lesson is in relation to anti-corruption is that we can set protocols for the next pandemic or the next crisis, and some of these protocols can be linked to conditions such as Carmen mentions in relation to audits or to tracking with new technologies the destiny and the results of the money and the resources that are transferred. I think that we can learn from the lesson, but now it's too late, I think.
Well, I think I have to defer with Damian on this one regarding Guatemala. I think Guatemala is a corrupt state, not just a democratic state with signals or exhibitions of corruption. I think it is a corrupt state in 2 ways. The substantive way, which is that formal and informal institutions are pervaded by both corporatism and patrimonialism. The mechanism is corporatism, and the aim and the way the system works, or the aim it works for, is patrimonialism. So in a way, it is everything designed with, of course, some goodwill contradictions. Everything is designed towards detracting resources from the public to the private. It's an extractive. You can see extractive institutions everywhere, both in the economy and in politics, and that is something that Robinson, for instance, said in a conference he gave some months ago here in Guatemala. Robinson, the author of Why Nations Fail. So I think it's corrupt, and everything is designed towards these ends. patrimonialistic ends. The IMF and the World Bank and Inter-American Development Bank and any other multilateral institution knows that and has to deal with that. Of course, I don't think they are very absolutely clean institutions, but let's say they aim for the good and for the well-being of people. The alternative would be leaving every credit to the internal banking system, the national banking system, which is twice as corrupt and which extracts even more resources from the public than lending multilateral institutions money would. Interest rates are much lower. The relation between the national bank officers, owners with the local politician mafia are much more are much stronger, and so the alternative is even worse, I think.
Thank you, Enrique, and thank you to all the panelists for tackling that question. I should note that we plan in June to having 2 consecutive corruption and COVID-19 events devoted to that theme. So, in other words, levels of oversight around the billions of dollars flowing from the World Bank, from the IMF to countries impacted, and the high likelihood that there'll be tremendous corruption attached to those flows. So we have about a little less than 5 minutes left, a couple more questions. And if the panelists could just take 30 seconds each to answer these 2 questions. The first question has to do with the use of technology and online platforms. And so the Alejandro Alvarado asks, what about the use of ICTs or TICs, I guess it is in Spanish, or communications technologies? So what about the use of ICT to oversee the process and the actions of governments for facing the emergency? So again, it'd be the use of technology to oversee government procurement. So if he ends up his question asking, this could be a solution for social audits at the local level. Anna, that's something that relates to what you were talking about.
Yeah.
So let's go to you first at just 30 seconds so we can get everybody in. Thank you.
At first instance, in the health sector, in mobilizing digital tools to better monitor the pandemic, track, test, inform decision-making, I think that technology is critical at regional and local levels. And in social media, in relation to social audits, is a very, very high area of opportunity. The use of web-based and mobile technologies to turn communication into interactive and fast dialogue. It can make many different forms, including internet forums, weblogs, microblogging, video. Well, it's huge. Social media is becoming a growing tool to implement social audits. And I can share with you a link to a very interesting manual of social audits, where it includes some highlights related to technology and how these social audits can go to a next level due to the technological opportunity. Thank you.
Demian?
Thank you. I think that's a key question. ICT politics, I'm saying TICs because in Spanish we say TICs, are key to control public spending. So the web-based information was key in detecting these 2 cases that I spoke earlier about overprices. So the information gets posted and we all can access it. So Argentina is at a great point in digitalization. So we think that the ICTs are key in detecting corruption, following up on that public spending, but also we have to develop on artificial intelligence and big data for decision making. I mean, we have these two approaches in controlling, but also producing better public policies.
Thank you, Damian. Enrique, very, very briefly.
Yeah, I agree with what Dave said, but I also see a very evident limit to TICs, to information and communication technologies, namely that they tend to be quite elitists, both in their requirement of expertise they need right now, at least at the point we are at in Guatemala, because they require some expert knowledge. And second, in the interest. I mean, it is not that easy to get common people interested in this kind of audit or supervision. It's not grassroots activism, which is quite easier to build, so to speak, and that kind of activism and knowledge, it is difficult to find in villages outside, even not even urban areas, outside the capital, Guatemala City.
Enrique, thank you very much. We have one more question that I think is worth getting to. We'll go a couple minutes over. If the panelists could just answer with one word or one sentence, that would be ideal. But this question has to do, it sort of helps us end this 90-minute session on an upbeat note. It's a question from Juanita Alaya asking, it seems there is a lot of concern with oversight and control mechanisms during COVID, and that's right. However, has there been in any of your countries an attempt to emphasize or reinforce positive behavior that you have seen? So good things, solidarity, honesty, integrity. Anna, I'll go to you first. Very, very short answer, one word or one sentence, please.
Unfortunately, not at the level as I would aim. I have seen certain initiatives of solidarity and integrity, but in general, Mexico is, I think, that covered by fear now, and many opportunities are there to build up from civil society.
Thank you. Damian?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I'm going to be very brief, but in Argentina, we have seen some of that solidarity measures. We have seen lots of donations from the private sector to the public sector. And also we have seen signs of political amicability between different political parties. So that's a new thing given by the coronavirus. Thank you.
Thank you. Enrique, very briefly.
Yes, more or less the same thing. We've seen initiatives of solidarity and altruism out of emotion and perhaps Christian charity. But after 5 years of struggle against corruption, the most organized institutions of civil society seem exhausted and very eroded. And those who in other times, in times of yore, would have been the ones leading the fight right now are drenched and have no, don't have the resources, the power, the legitimacy to do it.
Enrique, thank you very much. And with that, we're going to wrap up this 90-minute session. Wanted to say a big thanks to our panelists calling in from 3 different countries, Guatemala, Mexico, and Argentina. As a reminder, this is part of a weekly series, COVID-19 and corruption. If you're interested in this subject, join us every Wednesday morning, or on a daily basis, we push out information on the theme through our WhatsApp channel. To subscribe to that, just drop us an email at acgc@cipe.org. A special thanks to our colleagues at the International Republican Institute, Eguar Lizundia and Laura Boyette, who helped put this together and help arrange Enrique's participation, and the CIPE team as well that helps put these on every week. So that's Caitlin Newcomb, Ben Schmidt, Kai Bernier Chen, and Peter Glover. Thanks to all of you for doing this. And this week we had special help from our colleagues in the Latin America section at CIPE. So that's Lainey Padbury, John Zemko, Martin Friedel. Thank you for helping us select such wonderful panelists. And we'll see you all again next Wednesday